Okay, we'll get started. Today the topic for our discussion is popular politics. On the overhead here you've got 4 arguments that I'd like to make in the course of this lecture. The first argument is that common people engaged in a variety of political structures that were often separate from the state or only loosely related to the state. Up to now, at this, in this module, up to this point, when we've talked about politics, mainly we've talked about the state. And so today I want to suggest to you that there were a number of ways in which common people engaged in political activities without really relating to the state. Okay? So that's point number 1. Point number 2, common people had their own ideas of political legitimacy, and we'll talk about a few of those ideas. The third point is that revolts revolts were one element of popular political activity. But they were what we might think of as the tip of the iceberg of popular political activity. There were other activities going on in relation to revolts that have received less attention. And then the last point that I want to make is that popular politics changed with a shifting social environment over time. Okay, so we'll say something about over the course of this whole early modern period, from the early 16th century to the 18th century, there were shifts in popular politics, so we'll try to identify a couple of those shifts. Let me also make 2 other quick announcements or comments. One is that there's a lot to discuss when it comes to popular politics, so I've had to make choices, okay? One of the things that I won't be talking about today is politics on the most basic level, which in my mind is the level of the family, within families or between families. I think that we can think about the history of the family and relationships within and between families as part of the history of politics. But I just don't have time to cover everything. The second point that I wanted to make, and that's just one example. I mean, there are other elements of popular politics that we're not going to get into. But the second point that I wanted to make is that in your course packs, the primary source document is incorrect. And here we have the correct primary source document. This has also been emailed to you. So check your email, or if you want, come pick up one of these. So this is for the reading and seminars this week. This document, plus there are 2 articles that are in your course packs. An article by Burke, an article by Villari, and then this primary source document. Here we've got an image on the overhead of, it looks like a kind of a wardrobe, which is what it is. The word wardrobe comes from the word guardaroba, which means a place where you keep stuff. Literally, that's what it means. And this is a wardrobe that doubled as an archive in the early modern period for something called the République des Escartons, which was a confederation of 7 village communities in what are today the French Alps. So there was this political organization, this association, that had its own archive, and they engaged in other kinds of activities. It's kind of interesting because you can see here that on the front of the wardrobe there are 8 locks. That's because each of the 7 communities had its own key to the archive, and the 8th key was held by the secretary of the association, such that the archive could only be opened when someone from each of the 7 communities was there, plus the secretary. Then they could put all their keys in all the locks and open the archive. I wanted to start, though, with a couple of other images, and these are images relating to popular revolts, or perhaps to popular revolts, let's say. They're images of some kind of violent activity involving common people, and I have to say that I stumbled upon them kind of by accident because I was looking for some things to illustrate the slides, and I saw that there were a whole number of different versions of this same event. The original author is a guy named David Winkboons, who's from the Netherlands, who was working in the late 16th, early 17th century, and he painted a number of different kinds of scenes involving common people, a lot of them, including this scene. And then there were he did a number of versions of this scene, and then other people also did their own takes on the same scene. What interested me, though, was the variety of different titles that were given to these different images. So if we look at the image itself, we see that we've got some people running out of a doorway. We've got this guy holding this contraption here. There's a big stick, and then there's like a connection thing and another stick. Does anyone know what that thing is? Tom, what is that thing? Do you know?
Yes, for threshing wheat.
For threshing wheat, you know, when you cut down the wheat and you have to separate the grains from the stalks, you put all the wheat down on like a floor, and then a bunch of people get around and bang on it with these sticks here to thresh, to separate the grain from the stalks. And then we've got this other woman who has some kind of implement, maybe some tongs for the fireplace in her hand, and she's coming out, and you can see that they're chasing off some people. There's a man here. There's a woman who's holding a child in her arms. So the title here is Peasants Chasing Soldiers and a Food Seller. Okay, so perhaps this guy's the soldier and the woman maybe is the food seller. Then we have a different image. You can see that it's a mirror image, right? It's going in the other direction, but the same kind of, actually the same implements being held, and the same kind of situation in which there's a guy running off with his arms up and a woman who's being chased off. We've got the same guy with a knife who seems to be confronting the people who are exiting from the doorway. So this one is called Peasant Sorrow. Totally different title. The explanation where I found this slide was that this was an engraving done that showed a series of scenes, and in the preceding scene, it was inside this building, which was like a tavern, and there were a whole bunch of soldiers around who were coming in and drinking and eating and kind of being disruptive in the tavern. So presumably, the peasants who ran the tavern were not happy about this, and so they chased them away. And it's called Peasant Sorrow because presumably it's an example of how peasants during the early 17th century were being abused and were sad because of it. Peasant Sorrow. Here we have one in color, right? Back to the original direction. It might be kind of difficult to see from the back, but the same kind of events happening. This one, however, is called, I saw two different titles for this slide. One is Country Pub Brawl, so some kind of a fight in a pub. The other is Peasants' War, which is actually the first title that I had seen, which is why I was attracted to this slide, which suggests that there are peasants involved in some kind of an organized uprising. Then we've got this one, an innkeeper and his wife driving out a family. So now these people this is a family, and they're being run out of an inn, and so presumably this is the innkeeper and his wife. Otherwise, similar elements. Then I think the last example that I wanted to show you is this one, and in this case it's peasants driving out a rich family from a house. What I think is interesting here is that, check out this guy with the knife. See the guy with the knife? He switched sides. He's decided that maybe there's more weapons with the people driving the guys out, and so he's going to be on their side. At any rate, peasants driving out a rich family from a house. Well, the point of this, it seems to me, is that there's a lot of confusion amongst those people who were giving the titles to these slides, and it's not clear whether the people who assigned the titles were people at a later date who were looking back at these images, or whether these titles were assigned during the late 16th, early 17th century. But it seems to me that confusion over what's being depicted related to a confusion about peasant revolts. What goes on? What's going on, really, in a peasant revolt? Who's attacking whom and why? And also about popular politics in general. So what was going on? How do we make sense of popular politics over the actions of people like these who are depicted? Well, I want to attack this question by starting off, first of all, with a discussion of the variety of popular political structures that existed in early modern Europe. There were a whole number of ways in which people asserted authority over other people and shared power that, again, were distinct from the state the way we've been talking about it up to now in state institutions. So towns, villages, even neighborhoods. These were structures in which common people organized themselves and made decisions about things that were important to them. Confederations, like the confederation of the République des Escartons that I showed you before. This was a collection of villages, and there were that organized themselves to obtain their common needs. And there were examples of these kinds of organizations, associations across Europe. Ecclesiastical groups, so you can think of within the church, whether it's a diocese, whether it's a cathedral chapter. So within a diocese, there were other smaller groups of people who organized themselves, and they had revenues that they administered, and they collected rents from those revenues. Monasteries, you can think of as a kind of a political structure of this type. Confraternities, right? A religious association of lay people that, again, had their revenues. They had their own, they organized processions and ceremonial activities. Guilds within towns, what I'm calling resource exploitation societies. These were institutions that came into being because they were necessary to manage the exploitation of a common resource. Let me give you one example. In the Alps, which is an area that I study, the Alps are actually, a lot of parts of the Alps are very dry, depending on where you are, and so irrigation was important. And so one thing that communities did in some alpine areas was to dig irrigation canals that might be dozens and dozens of miles in length, maybe beginning at a glacier where there was water and then going through the mountains to a place where they could irrigate the countryside. Well, in order to engage in a project like that, you had to have people from a number of communities cooperate and organize themselves. And then once the work was completed, in order to maintain these canals, they needed to continue to organize themselves and talk about repairing a ditch or who was going to get the water at what times during the week and so forth. So this is what I mean by a resource exploitation society. Finally, representative assemblies. We've talked about these before. This is the three estates of Languedoc. Throughout Europe, there were representative assemblies at different levels of society. When we talk about the three estates, who are the three estates and the three estates? Does anyone know? Three groups.
Nobility, clergy, and everyone else.
Right. So, well, the nobility, the clergy, and then the towns. The third estate, when we refer to the third estate, that really meant the towns. They weren't really making decisions on behalf of peasants. They were making decisions on behalf of themselves. But that's right. And there were these kinds of assemblies. There were also peasant assemblies that came into being at certain times in certain places. But that's just a sampling of the variety of popular political structures that existed. In terms of common features of these structures, you can identify things that these structures had in common. Statutes, which is like a constitution or a set of operating papers, a document that says this is how we're organized, this is how we do our business, this is our authority. Officers, they were elected officers. They had regular meetings, and these would have been spelled out. They kept accounts because they might have to collect revenues or pay out revenues. So they kept these account books, and they also had archives, like the image we saw before in the wardrobe. So, and this is even a peasant village typically would have its own archive. It would have a place where it kept its record. Okay, so, and in fact, villages were the most common kind of popular political structure, the village community. So let me say a couple things about a village community. Villages had assemblies. So they might meet once a year, or sometimes they might have extraordinary meetings if something else came up, and they might be called together through a drum or through the ringing of a bell. Usually every adult male in the village would participate in the assembly, and if a matter came up for discussion, they all could have a vote. In some places, women also participated, so it was not excluded that women were not always excluded from participation in these village assemblies. These assemblies appointed executive officers. Usually they would meet in front of the church, if there was a parish church or an important chapel, or some kind of a square, or there might be a special tree, and they might meet under that tree, so they had regular places where they would get together. The officers elected by the village assembly would be responsible for managing resources. Above all, coordinating farming activities. When the people in the village were going to sow, when they were going to engage in different activities related to the agrarian cycle over the course of the year. They also oversaw the use of the common land. They administered the communal treasury, the use of other kind of common institutions like ovens, mills to grind the grain, maybe a butchery or a smithy. They had to decide who was going to be in charge of these things and how they would be used. The maintenance of roads, things like irrigation canals, bridges, dikes, all of these things had to be decided by the village assembly. Relations with the local lord, if there was one, supporting a priest, supporting a school teacher, organizing military conscripts. So there are all these different kinds of activities overseen by the village community and its elected officers. Now, another thing that a kind of political authority that was asserted on a local level was social control. So there were norms that were expected within the village, especially regarding relationships within the family. And if there was a householder, the head of a household, a man who was the head of a household whose family was in debt, or he was spending all his time drinking, or the people in his family were out of control, there would be rituals that were organized to shame the person involved into trying to change his ways or her ways. And I think you've read probably about some of these things in other readings. One of the typical shaming rituals was to have a person ride through the town on a donkey facing backwards. And this is an image of a Protestant martyr. So it's not from a village, but it's the best one I could find of a guy sitting backwards on a donkey. So there we have that image. Another kind of ritual of social control was something called the charivari. And this existed especially to manage the marriage market in a town. If you have in a town, let's say a wealthy family that has a daughter who's of marriageable age, you can imagine that the young men in the town who are not yet married would all be interested in marrying this daughter if she's going to bring an important dowry. And sometimes it happened that people from outside the town would move in, and one of them would marry this woman, especially if they were wealthy from another place. And the young men in the town would not be happy about this state of affairs, and so they would organize to try to put pressure on this new family or on this wealthy person, or let's say someone who was a widower who wanted to remarry and take on a second dowry. They would put pressure on this person not to do it because it was considered outside of the bounds of normal activity. So there's a famous case, a true story that was actually the subject of a film called The Return of Martin Guerre that maybe has anyone seen that film, The Return of Martin Guerre? In which there's an episode of charivari, and there's a case where a son of a wealthy family that just moved into the community ends up marrying a daughter of a wealthy family, and the other young people are not happy about it. So there's this kind of a ritual that's going on in the village during Candlemas Day, and they kind of ritually attack the son who married this wealthy daughter, and it turns out that the son and the daughter who had just gotten married are unable to have children, so they're also making fun of the couple for that reason too. So we can take a quick look at this episode here. It's probably hard to see, but that's the guy dressed up like a bear, the son of the wealthy family. It's probably hard to see, isn't it? The light. They're taking some scissors and they're castrating him, and then he's running off. He's not too happy. They didn't really castrate him. He had like a big bone. And that's where he lived. That's his father. That's his wife. That's Bertrand, that's the wife. So the guy's father throws out some money too, so they go after the money, and so they'll disperse, the crowds will disperse. That's how he gets rid of them. So you can see that they're making fun of the couple, and it's a way to try to exert some control over the decisions that are made in the community. Another point that I wanted to make about the village community, and this is something that's been emphasized by recent scholars, and that is that villagers understood the law and the importance of the law and how it worked. And within any village, just about, there was at least one person who knew how to read and write, often a notary on the continent. And so when villagers had disputes with their lord or with some other institution, they would use this person's knowledge of writing in order to pursue these disputes in legal venues, in a court of law, in different kinds of courts. And this is something that one scholar has referred to as adversarial literacy. So when we think about village communities and popular communities, we need to be aware of the fact that the tools of literacy were accessible to some of them, and they understood how the system worked, and they used those tools in order to press their claims. All right, there are a lot of local disputes in which villages were involved. One thing that scholars have pointed out, for example, is that when there were revolts in some places, these revolts sometimes were not successful because of divisions among the villagers. We've talked about this before when we talked about the peasantry. Right? There are some peasants who are quite wealthy. There are others who might be wage laborers and don't have enough land and have to find other ways to support themselves. And so people within villages do not always share all of the same interests. Sometimes disputes, these kinds of conflicts of interest, undermined collective action. And in fact, sometimes we can talk about these disputes within village communities or within local communities as things that actually ended up defining the community. Some scholars have looked at how our understanding of what constituted a village community really was based on documents, that were produced in the course of conflicts. Okay? So for example, how do I know when Wivenhoe came into, let's imagine Wivenhoe in the Middle Ages, and I'm just making this up. How do I know when Wivenhoe came into being as a community? Well, one way that I can find that out is by looking in the archives. And chances are the records that I'm going to find in the archives are records of disputes between some group in Wivenhoe and some group in some other community that's let's say Brightlingsea, all right, some other Colchester, some other community. And it was through those disputes that the boundaries of Wivenhoe and who was declared to be living in Wivenhoe became established. Okay, so the disputes themselves probably grew out of conflict over resources. You know, this pasture land, or the right to use this field, or the right to control traffic on the river out here. Okay, so it's through conflict often that our understanding of the boundaries of communities and what communities were came into being. And this also relates to the question of border disputes. And the point that I'll make quickly about border disputes is that these kinds of conflicts between communities, when they occurred, sometimes they occurred, let's say, between a community that was subject to one lord or one state, one ruler, and a community that was subject to another ruler. And sometimes what happened was that rulers got drawn into these disputes, not of their own accord, but because of actions that were being taken on the local level between these communities. So this is one way in which popular political concerns and local disputes could end up conditioning or forcing rulers or sovereigns to react and to themselves become engaged in some kind of a local dispute. Last point here has to do with religion. In the village level, church institutions or religious institutions were important. Let's say there were means by which groups on the local level asserted their identity. Angelo Torre, Torre, is one scholar who has shown how confraternities and individual families use religious spaces in order to create ritual sites that reinforce their own authority. Okay, so yeah, I mean, even think about a Catholic area, and you've got a church with a parish priest, and you would assume that that parish priest is the most important figure in that religious community. Well, it wasn't necessarily always the case. You might have families or confraternities within a community that, even within a given church, had their own altars or a chapel that was considered more important than the main chapel where the parish priest said the Mass. So these religious spaces could be used by groups or individuals, families within communities in order to assert their own power. Quickly, popular ideas of legitimacy. I want to suggest to you that common people engaged in political action because they had feelings, they had beliefs about what was right, what was legitimate when it came to politics. And one of these beliefs was the idea that the Latin phrase is quod omnes tangit, that which affects everyone should be approved by everyone. That's the principle. That which affects everyone should be approved by everyone. So, for example, if someone wants to create a new tax, some kind of a new fiscal contribution, then whoever will have to pay that tax should have some kind of a say in approving it. Okay, and that's a principle of law and a tradition that's deeply rooted in the Middle Ages. And that, I mean, when you think about the village assembly itself, right, the assembly as a whole is meeting to make decisions. And that's one of the key principles underpinning the village assembly. Another principle is this Latin phrase, one may meet force with force. If someone attacks me, I have the right to use force to defend myself and to fight back. Okay, this was another principle of law that was, again, rooted in the Western consciousness and animated many village communities. So there were notions also of transcendent justice, of a kind of a fairness that could justify popular actors, peasants, in taking actions. When there was, for example, if I have a reciprocal agreement with my lord, I'm giving certain things to my lord in exchange for his protection. And if it turns out that my lord routinely is just not keeping up his end of the bargain, well, that contravenes this notion of justice. And so that might be a circumstance in which peasants feel then justified in taking some kind of an action. I want to suggest to you that there were also important ideas that came from Christianity, from a Christian tradition, that informed popular notions of legitimacy. One of these is the idea of there being people being united in a social body. That is, a community was a whole, it was unified. And its identity was unified. Here you've got a picture of a Corpus Christi procession. This is from Peru, but there were similar kinds of processions throughout Europe. This is from the late 17th century. What does Corpus Christi mean? The body of Christ. So this was a festival that began really in the late Middle Ages, but then it became especially important during the Counter-Reformation in Catholic communities in order to celebrate the host, right? The body of Christ, the Eucharist, in the Eucharist, but that also underline the importance of the social body. Right? Just as when Catholics take communion, they're all participating in one body, the body of Christ, so is the political or social body unified. Okay, so these Corpus Christi processions were important moments in which the political community stressed its unity. Similarly, during the Protestant Reformation, scholars have pointed out something called the communal Reformation, in which they suggested that in the early 16th century, a number of towns adopted the Reformation as a way of expressing their unity as a town and declaring their autonomy, their independence as a town, especially if they were involved in some dispute with the local bishop. So this idea of a social body being unified is deeply associated with the Christian tradition. There's also this idea of social and spiritual equality. If you think back, well, I don't remember if we talked about this, but there was an event called the Peasants' Revolt in the late 14th century in England. And one of the themes or one of the sayings, one of the things that people said, I think we did talk about it at the beginning of the class. One of the famous sayings was, when Adam delved in Eve's span, who was then the gentleman? In other words, at the beginning, when there was Adam and Eve, there were no nobles, there were no peasants, everybody was the same. And we all descend from Adam and Eve. Therefore, on some level, we're equal. And there are also other messages of spiritual equality in Christianity, I think, that also have to be considered as part of a popular set of ideas concerning legitimacy. There's also, at many places in the Christian scriptures, there are ideas about economic fairness that come out, especially in the Old Testament, especially in terms of not exploiting the poor. When you read the Old Testament prophets, they're throughout this idea of not exploiting the poor. And I wanted to just take a look at another image really quick here that might be, I apologize, is difficult. We probably should have shut all the curtains here. It's kind of washed out. But can anyone tell what's going on in this image that's by probably Francesco Bassano from the late 16th century? Does anyone know what this story is? Here you've got, there's some stairs here. There's some people in fancy clothes talking back here. Here you've got, see this guy in the corner? There's a table there. And it looks like there's some money on top of the table with a nice rug covering it. And here in the middle you've got some guy with a kind of a rope in his hand that's doubled up. And he seems to be hitting people. And then you've got a couple of birds down here on the bottom. Okay, this is a scene from the New Testament. Actually, let me read you the text. It's from Matthew 21. And it's Christ going to the temple and chasing the money changers out of the temple. Okay? The temple in Jerusalem. And what caught my attention about this text, and I don't think anyone's worked on it, I think it would be a wonderful project if someone's thinking about an independent research project, to do a study of images of this scene from the gospel, because in some ways it's a very subversive scene. And so the question is, how did people in the early modern period deal with this kind of subversive scene that was also a key part of the gospel? And what caught my attention is that you've got people from the countryside coming into a city and causing havoc. So here you see, as they approached Jerusalem, that's Jesus and his group, and they came to Bethpage on the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent 2 disciples, saying to them, "Go to the village ahead of you, and at once you'll find a donkey tied there with her colt by her. You untie them and bring them to me. If anyone says anything to you, say that the Lord needs them. He'll send them right away." This took place to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet. "Say to daughter Zion, see, your king comes to you." So this person from the countryside is depicting himself as a king, gentle riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. The disciples went and did as Jesus had instructed them. They brought the donkey and the colt and placed their cloaks on them for Jesus to sit on. A very large crowd spread their cloaks on the road, while others cut branches from the trees and spread them on the road. The crowds that went ahead of him and those that followed shouted, "Hosanna to the Son of David." So this is like a triumphal entry, basically, right? There's crowds of people, some guy coming from the countryside, and they're greeting this person as a king. "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, Hosanna in the highest." When Jesus entered Jerusalem, the whole city was stirred. So the city is thinking, What are these crowds that are coming from the countryside? And asked, who is this? The crowds answered, this is Jesus the prophet from Nazareth in Galilee, which is a small town in the middle of the countryside. Jesus entered the temple courts and drove out all who were buying and selling there. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves. And they were selling doves so that they could use them in sacrifices, because they engaged in these sacrifices in the temple. And then Jesus criticizes them, and then at the end, he heals some people. And the priests and the teachers of the law, there's people standing on the stairs in the background, said, what's going on? They were indignant. They were not happy about it. And Jesus says, from the lips of these people, these children are saying these things, and it's basically prophesied in the Old Testament that they would do such things. And at the end, he leaves the city and goes back to the countryside. So I think that this is an interesting episode. And if we look again, we can see here the table with the money changers, the priests in the background, and then the scene taking place. I think that's an interesting example of how in the Gospels themselves, there are parts of this Christian tradition which could be seen as a kind of a revolt which was taking place. Now, there were a number of revolts in Europe, uprisings, between the 14th and the 17th century. Obviously, I don't expect you to write all these down or to remember them. This will be the PowerPoint will be posted on the course site. But you can see that there were a number of them, and this is just only a selection of popular revolts that existed that encompassed a number of areas, not just one village, but wider places. So questions about what these revolts meant have been examined by scholars. One scholar, Wayne Tabrake, has said, through these kinds of revolts, common people shape European history in the sense that they forced often governments to respond to their actions, to send out armies, to change their policies, or to not take certain policies because they were concerned about popular responses. So one could argue, and Tabrake has argued, that through these revolts, common people were playing a role in political events on a large scale, kind of a state-level scale in Europe. One of the problems with studying revolts is defining what was a revolt, what counts as a revolt, or what counts as a peasant revolt. Which sounds kind of like a stupid question, but if you think about it, it's not so dumb. So bandit activity, for example, which was rife in Europe, especially in southern Europe. You had groups of bandits, especially in mountain areas, who lived and pillaged from passers-by, but also elsewhere in Europe there were bandit groups. Do those guys count as people engaged in a revolt? Was it like a constant low-level revolt? In fact, there's a historian named Eric Hobsbawm who said, yeah, bandits were engaging in revolts. He wrote a book called Primitive Rebels, in which he depicts bandits as people who are rebelling against the growing authority of the state. Or when it comes to a peasant revolt, do you have to be a peasant? Does a revolt have to be only peasants that count as a peasant revolt? What if the leaders were, let's say, a local noble? Or if a local noble or a merchant was involved in the activity, is it still a peasant revolt? Those are the kinds of questions that some scholars have asked. Other scholars have said, well, let's just try to explain these phenomena. Why did they happen? And the oldest explanation was that these revolts were mechanistic. They happened because people were hungry. It was physical. It was I'm hungry. I don't have anything to eat. My village is all the same. We're going to rise. We're going to take up arms. We're going to take our threshing things and go beat people over the head because we want something to eat. So it's this explanation of revolt, which is similar to another explanation, which is that revolts were ways by which common people who were under so much pressure occasionally just had to let off steam. These are mechanistic or deterministic in the sense that they suggest that common people are behaving like animals, really. When pushed to a certain circumstance, they automatically have to respond in a certain way by a revolt. Okay, so some scholars have said that takes away the possibility for common people exercising agency of their own, for them taking an initiative and having their own ideas and making decisions about their actions. So other scholars have said, and this is a reference to E.P. Thompson, who wrote an essay called The Moral Economy of the English Crowd in the 18th Century. This essay was published in 1970. E.P. Thompson said, when people engaged in revolt during the early modern period, they did so because they were defending certain beliefs. They were defending certain principles. The principles, for example, of the economy and of reciprocity in an economy. That is, the economy should work in a certain way that benefits everyone, according to the common people whom Thompson studied. And when there were merchants or others who were trying to take advantage of economic interactions to benefit themselves without regard to the common good, to this broader moral economy, the people concluded that's not right, and for principled reasons, they revolted. Okay, so there was also this interpretation that revolt had to do more with a principled defense about economic fairness. Some scholars, and in a way the article that you've been assigned by Peter Burke for the seminar this week, he kind of moves in this direction. They emphasize the ritual elements of revolts. That when common people are engaging in revolts, they're in a way following a script. They're doing things that are expected in this kind of a situation. That's Burke's way of making sense, or that's the way that by which these kinds of scholars make sense of revolts. They don't spend as much time or effort trying to understand why revolts took place. Instead, they focus on this ritual element. And even more recently, well, there's a scholar named Hugues Neveu, whose name you'll see on a following slide, so I won't write it down, who have said that we should really think about peasant revolts as one possible action among many actions that peasants took in response to certain kinds of pressures, or in response to situations that they deemed unfair, that contradicted their transcendent ideas of justice. And Hugues Neveu and other scholars have said, look, we zero in on revolts, but revolts were not the only kinds of actions that common people were taking. They might also be meeting with their lords to present their grievances. If that didn't work, they might file a lawsuit. If that didn't work, they might make a threat that they were going to revolt. And if that didn't work, they might actually revolt. But there might have been a long history of other kinds of actions that they took. So Hugues Neveu says, rather than trying to isolate one particular cause of a revolt, which he thinks is probably not possible, and which he thinks scholars usually do because they want to use that information in order to make some kind of an ideological point. Hugues Neveu says we should think about revolts as a large complex of activities, and the actual taking up arms as one element among many. Now, I do think that it is possible still to point out that there were certain conditions in the early modern period that exacerbated these tensions, that added pressure to the experience of common people. In a recent issue of the American Historical Review, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, a scholar named Jeffrey Parker and some others participated in a forum about this concept of the 17th century crisis. The 17th century crisis as an idea was developed in the 1950s, and it points out that during the 1600s there were a lot of different events, developments that created problems for Europe politically and economically. For one thing, there was this little ice age that we've talked about before. The winters were longer and wetter, and the summers were shorter, and that had an effect on harvests during the 17th century for the most part. And this was global, this wasn't just in Europe. There were revolts in a number of places, popular revolts, again, not just in Europe, but also in China. Remember, this is the period in the 17th century when the Ming Dynasty fell and was replaced by the Qing Dynasty, the invaders from Manchuria. But also in other parts of the world, there were uprisings and revolts. In Europe, obviously, the 30 Years' War that we talked about last week. The 30 Years' War not only caused the kinds of death rates that we described, but it also disrupted trade throughout Europe. If I'm a merchant and Germany has exploded in fighting, I'm not going to send my shipment of silk across Germany because it's probably going to get stolen by soldiers. So a lot of exchange came to a halt because of the 30 Years' War, and that affected the whole economy. So there were a number of things that were going on in the 17th century that created problems and lent themselves to revolts. Hugues, that's the guy whom I mentioned who said you have to look at revolts in a global context. I'm going to skip over him for a second. Well, I guess I can't because he's on my slide. One thing that he said about revolts is that he's interested in causality and the question about what causes revolts. And he says too often historians don't really explore the problem of causality. And if you think about it, I mean, we haven't really that much in this module, and my guess is that you probably haven't much in other modules. How can we talk about what causes change historically? He says too often historians, they just kind of assume that causality is related to a sequence of events. So you had A, B, C happen, and then D happened. So we just kind of assume, oh, D was caused by A, B, and C. Unless I have a particular ideological commitment, and then I say, well, A was really the most important thing, and someone else says, no, it was really B that was important, and they can argue about those things. But historians never really explain, well, wait a second, just because a sequence of events preceded some other event, and we can find the sequence that seems to replicate itself in other situations, that's not the same thing as showing that this sequence causes an event, right? So that's one of the questions that Hugues asks about our study of revolts. And the other thing is that he says is that we have to think about how common people assessed a given situation. And so how is their understanding of an event related then to actions that they took? All right, and the last point about revolts has to do with the idea of popular fury. There was a famous revolt that took place in this town, Fuenteovejuna, which is in Spain, and it took place in the 15th century, and it was the subject of a play written by Lope de Vega called Fuenteovejuna that was published in 1619. That's another good primary source if you're interested in a primary source for a paper. And the story of the play is that there was this evil lord in this village, and he was abusing the townspeople, and at the end of the play, the villagers rise up and kill the guy. And they all kind of do it together in a group. And when the investigators are sent out by the king to say, well, what happened here? Who is responsible? Who killed the lord so they can punish him? Everyone said, Fuenteovejuna did it. They all said, basically, the whole village did it. And I think this is interesting because it shows two things. One is that the villagers, they understand how the law works, and they know that if they don't isolate anyone and say, we all did it, then no one can really get punished because they're not going to kill the whole village. Why wouldn't they kill the whole village? Why wouldn't the king just...
No one could extract revenue from it.
Yeah, I mean, they want stuff from the village. Yeah, then they've got all these lands that aren't worked, so that's no good to kill the whole village. The second thing that's interesting about this episode is that I think the villagers themselves have an interest in saying, we did this out of fury, out of a moment of madness. It was a crime of passion. Okay? Because in a way, this disculpates them. This shows that they're innocent because it was a crime of passion. So sometimes we have an idea of popular revolts as being characterized as being led by a bunch of crazy villagers. And we assume that that image of the crazy villager is an image that's projected by some elite. But I think it's also possible that villagers themselves occasionally gave themselves characterized their own actions as being a case of popular fury in order to claim that they were innocent. Okay, last slide here, just make a couple of points about how popular politics changed over time. First of all, as the state's fiscal needs grew, I suggest to you that it became more dependent on commoners. Often we think about the rise of the state, the increase in state authority, and we think about the power relationship between commoners and the state as one way. I want to suggest to you that as the state needed more revenues, commoners increased their leverage because they're the ones who are contributing. The second point has to do with something called refeudalization, which means that during this period, late 16th, early 17th century, a lot of lords saw that the prices of land were rising because the population was rising. They invested in fiefs and in land, and they tried to exert as much as they could from the land and from the peasants because that's where the value was. And that's one thing I think that led to, especially during that period, an increase in tension between peasants and their lords. The third point is that there were new forms of printed political propaganda that drew commoners into political debates on the level of the state. And this is one example. This is from a newspaper. It's a political cartoon concerning a new tax proposal. So printed political propaganda over the course of the early modern period, little by little, drew villagers into disputes, not just about their local problems, but about state-level problems. Oops. And the last point has to do with the existence of an Enlightenment public sphere. And I don't have time to go into this in detail, but a public sphere basically means an area in which, through print, through newspapers, through discussions in the public, common people start to debate what's good for the state, and they start to become involved in discussions about politics. They become engaged, they become participants by the 18th century. And I suggest to you that this participation in politics during the Enlightenment was founded upon a much earlier and older tradition of popular political participation.